I'm Jami Floyd. Welcome to TED Talks in NYC, the series that brings TED.com's celebrated conversations to television and keeps the conversation going with some of the brightest minds in New York City. This week, we're going green. And did you know that New York's commitment to sustainability extends high above the city streets, 30 feet high to be exact? It's New York City's first and only park in the sky. Let's hear all about it from Robert Hammond in his 2011 TED Talk.
The High Line is an old elevated rail line that runs for 1.5 miles right through Manhattan. And it was originally a freight line that ran down 10th Avenue. And it became known as Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the trains that the railroad hired a guy on horseback to run in front, and he became known as the West Side Cowboy. But even with the cowboy, about one person a month was killed and run over. So they elevated it. They built it 30 feet in the air right through the middle of the city. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And by 1980, the last train rode. It was a trainload of frozen turkeys, they say, at Thanksgiving from the meatpacking district. And then it was abandoned. And I live in the neighborhood, and I first read about it in the New York Times in an article that said it was going to be demolished. And I assumed someone was working to preserve it or save it, and I could volunteer, but realized no one was doing anything. I went to my first community board meeting, which I'd never been to one before, and sat next to another guy named Joshua David, who was a travel writer. And at the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people that were sort of interested in the project. Most people wanted to tear it down. So we exchanged business cards, and we kept calling each other and decided to start this organization, Friends of the High Line. And the goal, at first, was just saving it from demolition. But then we also wanted to figure out what we could do with it. And what first attracted me or interested me was this view from the street, which is this steel structure, sort of rusty, this industrial relic. But when I went up on top, it was 1.5 miles of wildflowers running right through the middle of Manhattan, with views of the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty and the Hudson River. And that's really where we started the idea of coalesced around, let's make this a park and let's have it be sort of inspired by this wildscape. At the time, there was a lot of opposition. Mayor Giuliani wanted to tear it down. I'm going to fast forward through a lot of lawsuits and a lot of sort of community engagement. Mayor Bloomberg came in office. He was very supportive, but we still had to make the economic case. This was after 9/11. The city was in tough times. So we commissioned an economic feasibility study to try to make the case. And it turns out we got those numbers wrong. We thought it would cost $100 million to build. So far, it's cost about $150 million. And the main case was this is going to make good economic sense for the city. So we said over a 20-year time period, the value to the city in increased property values and increased taxes would be about $250 million. That was enough. It really got the city behind it. It turns out we were wrong on that. Now people estimate it's created about $500 million, or will create about $500 million in tax revenues for the city. We did a design competition, selected a design team. We worked with them to really create a design that was inspired by that sort of wildscape. There's 3 sections. We opened the first section in 2009. It's been sort of successful beyond our dreams. Last year we had about 2 million people, which is about 10 times what we ever estimated. This is one of my favorite features in section 1. It's this amphitheater right over 10th Avenue. And the first section ends at 20th Street right now. The other thing, it's generated obviously a lot of economic value. It's also inspired, I think, a lot of great architectures. There's a point where you can stand here and see buildings by Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Shigeru Ban, Neil Denari. And the Whitney is moving downtown and is building their new museum right at the base of the High Line. And this has been designed by Renzo Piano, and they're going to break ground in May. And we've already started construction on Section 2. This is one of my favorite features, this flyover where you're 8 feet off the surface of the High Line, running through a canopy of trees. The High Line used to be covered in billboards, and so we've sort of taken a playful take where instead of framing advertisement, it's going to frame people and views of the city. This was just installed last month. And then the last section, it was going to go around the rail yards, which is the largest undeveloped site in Manhattan. And the city has planned, for better or for worse, a 12 million square feet of development that the High Line is going to ring around. But what really I think makes the High Line special is the people. And honestly, even though I love the designs that we were building, I was always frightened that I wouldn't really love it because I fell in love with that wildscape and how could you recreate that magic. But what I found is it's in the people and how they use it that to me makes it so special. And just one quick example is I realized right after we opened that there were all these people holding hands on the High Line. And I realized New Yorkers don't hold hands. We just don't do that outside. But you see that happening on the High Line, and I think that's the power that public space can have to transform how people experience their city and interact with each other. Thanks.
Wow, that whole history of the High Line is so fascinating, and it's such a beautiful place if you've been there. Now, developing and maintaining a green space is a priority for New York City. Commissioner Adrian Benepe from the city's Department of Parks and Recreation is here to tell us all about it. Commissioner, welcome.
Great to be here, Jami.
So let's talk about the High Line. It is really cool, and I really urge everyone to get out there and see it if they haven't already. But let's talk about other major city projects in the works that take advantage of, I guess, what we can call wasted space, right?
Well, that's the whole thing. New York doesn't have a lot of open space. If we're going to build new parks, and we have to, the mayor said we need to, we're going to add 1 million people. Plan NYC was developed to have a greater, greener New York City and to make it more sustainable. To do that, we have to find land for new parks. And there aren't virgin forests waiting to be turned into parks. Luckily, we do have some forests that are almost virgin. But we have all of these industrial wastelands, this leftover, when industry left and went to other countries, when the shipping and docking industries left the harbor. And those are great opportunities. They're also very expensive. But all across the city, we're in the biggest period of park development and expansion since the 1930s, perhaps the biggest period in the city's history.
Now, you mentioned Plan NYC. Tell us a little more about that. What is that initiative? And what are your goals for the long term?
Plan NYC is the city's sustainable development plan. It's looking at things like air quality and water quality and residential housing and transportation, but also looks at parks. How to have the city be more livable by the year 2030. If we're thinking that 1 million more people will be living here. In the parks world, there's at least $400 million that's been allocated to create big new parks, to turn part-time schoolyards into full-time playgrounds, to make sure that every New Yorker is within a 10-minute walk of a park or playground, to add 1 million trees, to add hundreds of green streets, to create many new playing fields. And it's all going on despite the terrible economy that we're in, this global recession. The mayor has kept the budget very healthy for building new parks and for expanding and renovating old parks. But in addition to the Plan NYC projects, there are huge new park building projects like Brooklyn Bridge Park, an 80-acre new park not far from this studio on the Brooklyn waterfront. We're doing the Williamsburg Greenpoint waterfront as part of a big rezoning there. Hudson River Park construction continues. Massive new parks in the Bronx and parks along the Bronx River. Fresh Kills, where we're turning the old landfill, a 2,000-acre landfill, into a park. So everywhere you look across the city, in every neighborhood, there are new parks being built and old parks being renovated.
So again, using wasted space.
Using wasted space. A garbage dump is what could be more waste than a garbage dump?
Now, you mentioned Fresh Kills. Is there any health risk to creating a park on land that was landfill for, I think, about a half a century?
Yeah, there will be no health risk because we're very carefully guided by state DEC and health regulations, and there's nothing we do where we're not completely in partnership with regulators. The entire landfill has now been capped. There's 2 feet of topsoil on top of this cap. There's meadow grasses growing up there. We already have tours happening in the parks, and we're developing soccer fields in some of the low-lying areas. It will take about 30 or 40 years to complete. It's kind of like Central Park.
Almost as many years to complete as it's been there as landfill. Give us some more of a sense. You mentioned soccer fields, some more of a sense of what the completed project might look like. Some of the wonderful detail of what people might expect to see 30 years, 20 years from now?
Well, Fresh Kills Park, like Brooklyn Bridge Park, is recycling a landscape, so it's the ultimate recycling project. Then we're going to be growing a lot of the plants that we use on the site from native seeds that have been gathered in the area. It's largely speaking, it's kind of like a mountainous landscape. When you're on top of these capped landfills, it feels like an alpine meadow already. And there'll be running trails and cross-country trails, hiking, biking, horseback riding. It'll be like going to the Catskills here in New York City.
Okay, Alpine Meadow is not what people think of.
It feels like it. I've been up, I
City.
promise you, come up there and you have a 30-mile view into New Jersey. You can see downtown Manhattan. It's really an extraordinary place.
One thing critics have said, especially about the High Line, is that there's a disparity with the amount of development with parks like the High Line being built in wealthier areas of the city rather than in poorer areas. What's your response to that?
My response would be that it's simply not true. We're spending $600 million in the Bronx alone. We did, with some mitigation funds we got from a water filtration project, 77 different park projects to completely upgrade all the parks in the Bronx. We're spending $100 million in parks along the Bronx River. So we have spent, since the mayor took office, $3 billion across the city. There's another $1.5 billion in the budget. This is an unparalleled level of investment. And the mayor's commitment has been to a 5-borough strategy, to developing small downtown areas across the city, to having parks be the focus of economic development strategies, and to look at across the city and say every park needs great parks. Now, the nice thing about public-private partnerships, as at the High Line, is the city isn't paying anything to maintain the High Line. It's all being maintained through private donations. That means that I can take city tax dollars and put them in neighborhoods where there aren't a large concentration of wealthy citizens. The city pays very little toward the maintenance of Central Park because the Central Park Conservancy raises private donations. That means I can take scarce city resources and use those in parks in Harlem.
Robert Hammond says in his TED Talk, quote, "Public space can have the power to transform how people experience their city and interact with each other." So let me ask you, Commissioner, how do you feel that the city's green spaces transform the lives of New Yorkers?
In New York, parks are not just luxuries, they're necessities. Most of us live in apartments or small houses. Most of us don't have a front yard or backyard. The life of New York is an outdoor life. It takes place outdoors. We meet with people outdoors. We enjoy our music, our art, our dance. And what makes New York such a great city, I think, first and foremost, and Mayor Bloomberg would agree, is that it's a city of immigrants, that we all learn to get along and we strive together. But I think the other thing that makes it great is parks. And when the parks were bad, the city went down. When the parks are great, the city has come up. Could be a coincidence? I don't think so.
And we can't thank you enough for being here.
I think the best thing your viewers should do is get out into a park, winter, spring, summer, fall. They're really great.
All right. Well, thank you, Commissioner Adrian Benepe, Parks Commissioner for New York City.
Pleasure to be here.
And we can't talk about going green without bringing up recycling. Here in the U.S., we throw away 2.5 million plastic bottles every hour. Are they really recyclable, and where do they go? Well, for some answers, we're going to go to artist turned activist Dianna Cohen and her 2010 TED Talk.
I'm a visual artist, and I'm also one of the co-founders of the Plastic Pollution Coalition. I've been working with plastic bags, which I cut up and sew back together as my primary material for my artwork for the last 20 years. I turn them into 2- and 3-dimensional pieces and sculptures and installations. Upon working with the plastic, after about the first 8 years, some of my work started to fissure and break down into smaller little bits of plastic. And I thought, great, it's ephemeral, just like us. Upon educating myself a little further about plastics, I actually realized this was a bad thing. It's a bad thing that plastic breaks down into smaller little bits because it's always still plastic. And what we're finding is that a lot of it is in the marine environment. I then, in the last few years, learned about the Pacific Garbage Patch and the gyre. And my initial reaction, and I think that this is a lot of people's first reaction to learning about it, is, oh my God, we've got to go out there and clean this thing up. So I actually developed a proposal to go out with a cargo ship and 2 decommissioned fishing trawlers, a crane, a chipping machine, and a cold molding machine. And my intention was to go out to the gyre, raise awareness about this issue, and begin to pick up the plastic, chip it into little bits, and cold mold it into bricks that could potentially be used as building materials in underdeveloped communities. I began talking with people who actually had been out to the gyre and were studying the plastic problem in the marine environment. And upon doing so, I realized actually that cleaning it up would be a very small drop in the bucket relative to how much is being generated every day around the world. And that actually I needed to back up and look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is we need to find a way to turn off the faucet. We need to cut the spigot of single-use and disposable plastics, which are entering the marine environment every day on a global scale. So in looking at that, I also realized that I was really angry. I wasn't just concerned about plastic that you're trying to imagine out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, of which I've learned there are now 11 gyres potentially of plastic in 5 major oceans in the world. It's not just that gyre of plastic that I'm concerned about, it's the gyre of plastic in the supermarket. I go to the supermarket and all of my food is packaged in plastic. All of my beverages are packaged in plastic, even at the health food market. I'm also concerned about the plastic in the refrigerator. And I'm concerned about the plastic and the toxins that leach from plastic into us and into our bodies. So I came together with a group of other people who were all looking at this issue, and we created the Plastic Pollution Coalition. We have many initiatives that we're working on, but some of them are very basic. One is, if 80 to 90% of what we're finding in the ocean, of the marine debris that we're finding in the ocean is plastic, then why don't we call it what it is? It's plastic pollution. Recycling. Everybody kind of ends their books about being sustainable and greening with the idea of recycling. You put something in a bin and you don't have to think about it again. What is the reality of that? In the United States, less than 7% of our plastics are recycled. And if you really look into it, particularly when it comes to plastic bottles, most of it is only downcycled or incinerated or shipped to China. It is downcycled and turned into lesser things. While a glass bottle can be a glass bottle again or can be used again, a plastic bottle can never be a plastic bottle again. So this is a big issue for us. Another thing that we're looking at and asking people to think about is we've added a 4th R onto the front of the reduce, reuse, recycle 3 Rs, and that is refuse. Whenever possible, refuse single-use and disposable plastics. Alternatives exist. Some of them are very old school. I myself am now collecting these cool Pyrex containers and using those instead of Glad and Tupperware containers to store food in. And I know that I am doing a service to myself and my family. It's very easy to pick up a stainless steel bottle or a glass bottle if you're traveling and you've forgotten to bring your stainless steel bottle and fill that up with water or filtered water versus purchasing plastic bottled water. I guess what I want to say to everybody here, and I know that you guys know a lot about this issue, is that this is a huge problem in the oceans, but this is a problem that we've created as consumers and we can solve. We can solve this by raising awareness of the issue and teaching people to choose alternatives. So whenever possible, to choose alternatives to single-use plastics. We can cut the stem, tide the stem of this into our oceans, and in doing so, save our oceans, save our planet, save ourselves. Thank you.
How committed are New Yorkers to recycling? Well, joining me now are 2 people who are really in the know, Tom Outerbridge and no impact man, Colin Beavan. Welcome, gentlemen. And let's get right into it. Colin, I want to start with you because Dianna Cohen suggests in her TED Talk that we simply refuse the use of plastics. And I want to ask you how realistic that option really is, because you and your family did a year-long experiment with this, and you chronicle it in a documentary where you just refuse plastics and everything else to try to create a zero impact. Now, how did that go?
Well, it went fine, but one of the things that we learned, I mean, of course we can refuse plastics, and it's good to have integrity of with your values and your lifestyle.
It's important.
Yeah, of course, but also we have to accept that there are major changes that have to be made, and we're in the middle of an environmental crisis where whether we have 80,000 species a year going extinct on the planet, so the planet is severely stressed. So the question isn't just about whether one of us refuses plastic or not. The question is whether we can sustain a system where things are being made to be used once and then thrown away, or in the case of things like automobiles, made to be used for 5 years and then virtually thrown away. And how can we recreate a manufacturing system that makes things to be used over and over again and repaired, and therefore uses fewer resources?
So we have choices on the individual level, but then we also need to be making choices on the societal level.
When I was growing up, they used to say it's important that we have an informed electorate. Like, it's important that everybody knows what's going on. But most of us know what's going on. Most of us know that there are big problems in the world. What we need now is an engaged electorate. We need all of us to be in touch with our politicians, getting involved in movements, and actually forcing the kind of changes that need to be made if this habitat that we depend upon for our health and our happiness and security is going to remain safe.
Well, let me come then over to you, Tom, because you're the general manager of the Municipal Recycling Division of Sims Metal Management. That means that you, at Sims, recycle all of New York City's plastic, glass, and metal. So what do you think? Should New Yorkers, not just one individual or one family, should New Yorkers just refuse all plastics? Would that make a significant dent in our environmental problem?
Well, we would like to recycle all of New York City's plastics. Right now, about half of the plastics that are meant to be recycled go into the trash. So that's
But we're
and that's
really
just a
trying, Tom, aren't we?
Right, and I guess we would like, through public education and other programs, to make people aware of what, and actually there's some of the changes have to occur on the building level. It has to be made simple for people in the buildings, but regardless of the effort that is going on today, about half of the bottles and jugs, which are highly recyclable, which have great uses if they can make their way into the recycling stream, those materials are going into a landfill.
Now we're having this conversation about, well, do New York citizens put enough of their stuff in the recycling stream? But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the reuse of resources and recycling, that much of what even ends up in the recycling stream can't be recycled, or that plastics and other materials are thrown away pre-production, wasted pre-production. So the question is not just, can consumers change, but how do we actually change our manufacturing and production systems in ways that are both better for the planet and the people.
But what about putting more of the responsibility, Tom, back on the manufacturers?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of wasteful packaging out there. There's packaging that is produced that at the end of its life is not recyclable because they've laminated incompatible materials together, that kind of thing. So, and there's a lot of people working on that. We participate in trade organizations that are trying to influence the manufacturing industry to remove adhesives that are problematic in recycling and so forth. So there is a huge amount that is not under the control of the individual and should happen at that level.
Dianna Cohen, in her TED Talk, talks about plastic bottles being downcycled, shipped to China, that will never be plastic bottles again.
That particular statement is not accurate. I mean, our biggest customer for plastic soda bottles, which we recycle, soda and water bottles, today happens to be Coca-Cola. I mean, it shifts all around. It's a commodity, but most of the PET plastic that we sell today goes back into bottles. Much of the milk jugs and detergent bottles, those go also back to customers that are making bottles out of it. I mean, shipping it to China doesn't mean it's being downcycled, by the way. I mean, if China is producing fleece jackets that people in America are buying, and we sell them plastic bottles that can get made into those fleece jackets, I don't see that as automatically downcycling.
Coming back to the citizen piece of it, which we now understand is just a small piece of it, does the right thing, puts it in the recycling bin, and because the manufacturer hasn't done the right thing, it cannot be recycled. What happens to that unrecyclable material?
Well, all of the materials that people are asked to put into the recycling bin today are recyclable. We have processing capacity for them, we have markets for them. That said, there are any number of plastics out there that do not have markets today, or we get materials that we're not meant to get that we cannot market in those materials, they will. They'll go to a landfill or they'll go to an incinerator.
What can New Yorkers do to have an impact?
I mean, of course, there's things like you can carry your own bottles, and you know, bottled water is, for example, crazy because the water itself costs 1,000 times what it would cost if you just took it out of the tap. And in New York, we're privileged to have really great drinking water, and the more we use bottled water, the less our tap water will be protected.
And the tap water here, I would think New Yorkers know it. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic.
But how much effort does it actually take for New Yorkers not to engage, but to recycle on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think for most New Yorkers, it's actually relatively easy. The Department of Sanitation collects at the curb from every building once a week, and the building is responsible, well, depending on what type of building it is, to have containers to put your recyclables. That said, there's definitely some old housing stock in the city, particularly New York City Housing Authority buildings that have a chute for trash, which is very convenient on every floor, and you have to take your recyclables down the elevator, out the back. And so I think for some segment of the population, it is not as convenient as throwing it away as trash. And those are not quick fixes because you've basically got old infrastructure built around a very different way of handling waste.
The fact of the matter is that the corporations and the government are not yet doing enough. This isn't to say that recycling isn't good, because recycling is good. But
it can only help.
Yeah, it can only help. But to suggest that's all we need to do with the you know, our climate is changing. I think most New Yorkers looking at the weathers we had over the last summer will say that. And the meteorologists are finally accepting that the weird weather we're having is correlated to climate change. So the question is, can we let our elected politicians know that this is important? I mean, what it used to say, you know, when you looked at the list of issues and what's the most important, environment went way down at the bottom. But the environment is not something else. Environment is the habitat that we depend upon for our health and our happiness and our security. So how do we force it up the agenda? Because we're talking about our lives.
And some people would say, Tom, that once we drop our bottle in the blue basket, we feel, oh, I've done enough.
Recycling is not it's not going to solve all the world's problems. I mean, you know, our perspective is that if you have an object and it's come to the end of its life and it needs to be discarded and there isn't a reuse option for it, we'd like to see it go into a recycling system. But obviously, that's not going to make the garbage patch go away. I mean, the garbage patch is litter and stormwater overflows and ocean dumping. It's not coming from recycling bins. It's coming from people being discarded in the wrong place.
Now, we do have, I think, the hope of a new generation. I mean, I look at my children, and I think many of us look at our next generation coming up, and they're coming into the world that's already thinking about these issues, as opposed to people who've had to change the way we think about these issues, right?
Well, sure. I mean, my own little girl will tell me, you know, to not waste the water and turn the lights off, and that's good. I do think that there's an onus upon us to act more quickly than to wait for the next generation. Yeah, but of course, you know, our consciousness is changing, and that can only be to the good.
There's one message you could leave with our viewers about what they can do to move our world, not just our city, but there's our city, our country, and our world in the right direction. Tom, what would it be?
Well, from the small amount, it's a sort of small slice of, you know, sustainability in New York that we have to do with, which is really the recycling system. Making sure that your building has it in place, and there's a place for people to put their recyclables, and people are participating properly. I mean, that's obviously, you know, there's any host of issues that people could deal with, whether for transportation or energy, but sort of from my perspective, that's kind of what we are trying to contribute to the city.
And what message would you convey, Colin?
So I would say that if there's something that any of us could do, it would be to find a way to dedicate a certain amount, even if it's 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day, dedicate a certain amount of time to actually engaging in our community and our political processes to make the world that we want.
All right, so change your city, change your nation, and change your world. Excellent advice. Tom Outerbridge and Colin Beavan, I appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
And that is our show. Join us next time for more compelling conversation on TED Talks in NYC. We leave you what panelists from our other TED shows are doing to help clean up the environment. Thanks for watching. I'm Jami Floyd.
Recycling.
I pick up garbage.
I help to get rid of polluted attitudes towards people with disabilities.
I'm sending out tens of thousands of seeds to grow locally all over the country. picking up after my dog.
I'm living in smaller and smaller spaces.
So I yell at people who throw things out the car window.
I design zero waste clothes. And by waste, I mean W-A-S-T-E and not W-A-I-S-T.
I pee in the shower